Well, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome today at the seminar for our third meeting, Professor Timothy Williamson from Oxford University. The extraordinary scope and amount of outstanding works written by Tim in philosophy of logic and epistemology, metaphysics, as well as in the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind, makes it hard, if not impossible, to present Tim, of course, in a few words. I will not try to. I must confess that my first encounter with Tim's work was in 1994 through his illuminating book on vagueness, a topic I had been toying with myself for quite some time. And since then, I've been expecting all his publications. Just let me indicate some of the major ones. Tim's book, Knowledge and Its Limits, in 2000, again, which is now a classic, if not the classic, in epistemology, and a great source of inspiration for all of us contemporary philosophers, followed by almost 200 publications, right? And then came two other major books, The Philosophy of Philosophy, Blackwell 2007, Modal Logic is Metaphysics, Oxford 2013, and a very fine book which just came out, Tetralogue. For those of you who are less familiar with Tim's views, I highly recommend the volume which was edited by Patrick Greenaw and Duncan Pritchard in 2009, Williamson on Knowledge, Oxford 2009. And I think that Tim has a book in preparation, edited by Ioannis Hili-Vakouri, which will be devoted to his views on modality and which is going to be published at Routledge, I think. Well, for those of you who have attended my lectures, not no later than half an hour ago, it will not come as a surprise either that I should have invited Tim on this particular occasion. He is the co-author, among other things, of the important paper, Knowing How, published in the Journal of Philosophy in 2001, which was the starting point, together with Jason Stanley, which was the starting point of what has been called the intellectualistic wave, favoring an approach to practical knowledge or know-how in terms of knowing that or propositional knowledge, and in particular along a mostly linguistic approach. This is not to say that Tim's approach to the issues we are dealing with this year stop here. And as far as I can tell, merely from the paper he sent to us in advance, I have no doubt that he's going to put forward a number of other extremely important remarks as far as our understanding of practical knowledge is concerned, and in particular in terms of the very much needed examination of the relations between knowing and believing, acting and intending. So, Tim, many thanks again for coming to the Collège de France, and if you please.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. It's great to be here. There's a handout for the talk, which I hope you have. Usually when I have a handout, I make it by putting all the formulas in the paper on the handout, and then I have to explain that there'll be less in the talk than on the handout. But today I have to assure you that there'll be more in the talk than in the handout, because it's a pretty skimpy handout. So what I'm going to be talking about today is an analogy between knowledge and action. I, in fact, began Knowledge and Its Limits. I mean, the opening pages of it are about an analogy between knowledge and action. which I was never totally satisfied with. And so this talk is really an attempt to redo pretty much the same analogy, but in a different form, as you'll hear, which I think works better, I mean, more cleanly than the one I gave in Knowledge and Its Limits. But I'll start by saying something about how the analogy between knowledge and action in Knowledge and its limits came about, and then and one diagnosis of what is not quite satisfactory about it, and then I'll explain how I'm going to do things differently. So in Knowledge and Its Limits, the program was to reverse a kind of trend in a lot of epistemology over the previous half century or so, which had the effect of marginalizing knowledge in epistemology, a rather strange thing to do given the etymology. But I mean, what was going on was an approach to the theory of knowledge which really started with belief, as it were, in some sense, a more internal notion than knowledge. And then there was the sort of notorious program of trying to analyze knowledge in terms of belief. Of course, a program with precedents in Plato, but one that was particularly salient in the second half of the 20th century. And because of counterexamples to all the sort of nice simple analyses, it looked more and more as though knowledge was some kind of weird, gerrymandered sort of thing that had to be defined by sort of 10 rather random-looking clauses that anyway never quite worked. And so that the obvious question that these attempts to analyze knowledge in terms of belief raised was, well, if they're correct, then who cares about knowledge? Because knowledge seemed just this sort of rather random, pointlessly complicated notion. And in fact, a lot of epistemology in the second half of the 20th century, and even now, especially in North America, is of what one might call a belief-first kind, where people regard the really central notion in epistemology as justified belief. And what I wanted to argue in Knowledge and Its Limits was that actually knowledge itself really should be the central focus of epistemology, and rather than trying to understand knowledge in terms of belief, it would make more sense to understand belief in terms of knowledge. And that kind of raised a certain sort of question, because the way that people standardly thought about belief then, and I think still to a large extent today, is that belief and desire are a kind of package. That in some sense there's a kind of reverse symmetry between desire and belief. I mean, the picture was that to explain an action, one always has to invoke a combination of beliefs and desires. I mean, if somebody, let's say, moves their hand towards the water bottle, then you might explain that by saying that they're thirsty, but you have to include both the belief that there is a bottle of water over there and the desire for a drink to get a proper explanation of the action. And the sort of standard way of thinking about the relation between belief and desire was that although they're both needed to explain an action, that they differ in having opposite directions of fit, so that in some sense, with belief, you're fitting mind to world, as it were, you're somehow adjusting your mind to the world, and with desire, the direction of fit is the opposite. What you're trying to do is to adjust the world to your mind. There's a very nice example that's given in Elizabeth Anscombe's book Intention of this contrast in direction of fit. So it involves a man going shopping. He's been given a shopping list by his wife. Presumably, this is Peter Geach, Mr. Anscombe. But and so he's got a shopping list, and he's going around the shop trying to find items to match them to the list. So in his case, he's adjusting the contents of his shopping bag to the list. But there's also a detective who is following this man round the shop, and who's making a list of the items in the man's shopping bag. And in the case of the detective, I mean, the list may be have exactly the same contents as the husband's original shopping list, but the direction of fit is the opposite, because the detective is fitting the list that he's compiling of the contents of the shopping bag to the contents of the shopping bag, whereas the husband is fitting the contents of the shopping bag to the contents of the list. So in some sense, the detective's list has a kind of fitting mind to world belief style direction of fit, and the husband's shopping list has the opposite desire-like world to mind direction of fit. So that was, as it were, the picture of how belief and desire are related to each other. And the kind of question that this raised was, well, if we're thinking about the relation of knowledge to belief, and in my case trying to reverse the order of priority in explanation between them, what do we say on the, as it were, the mirror image side with the opposite direction of fit? So we could put it like this, that knowledge is to belief as what is to desire. What stands with the desire-like direction of fit to desire, as knowledge stands to belief with the opposite direction of fit. And the natural suggestion to make was that it's action. And just to give you an initial clue about why that's a natural suggestion, the key difference between knowledge and belief is that knowledge requires truth. If something is false, you don't know it, although you may think you know it. And And the difference between action and desire seems to be similar to that, in that with action, that involves in doing something. And by the way, I should say that when I talk about action here, I mean intentional action, not just as it were any old thing that in some sense you do. So, for example, when you eat your food, that's something that you do intentionally. So intentionally eating your food is an action. But for digesting your food, that's not something that you do intentionally. It's just something that happens whether you intend it or not. And so digestion would not normally be an intentional action, but eating would be, or intentionally eating would be. So that was the way that the analogy between knowledge and action was supposed to go in knowledge and its limits. And then the idea was that it would be crazy to marginalize the idea of action in the philosophy of action, to think that was just some kind of uninteresting peripheral phenomenon. And if there's this strong analogy between action and knowledge, then it would be equally crazy to marginalize knowledge on the reverse direction of fit. So that was the general picture. However, this is not a completely satisfying way of thinking of the matter, because this way of thinking suggests that desire is somehow more closely connected to action than belief is. I mean, the desire is on this side. But that doesn't really fit the original conception of the relation between belief and desire, because they were supposed to be the joint contributors to the explanation of action, that you needed both some beliefs and some desires to get an action. And so, from that point of view, belief and desire would be symmetrically related to action. And so it doesn't really make sense to have desire here as opposed to belief over there. So it seemed to me that we needed to rework the analogy. That although I always remain confident that there is a strong connection, this seemed to me not the most revealing way of elucidating it. And so given what the problem was, the problem was that both belief and desire, the way they're being thought of here, are inputs to practical reasoning, the kind of reasoning which, at least when things go well, results in action. But if we're looking for something that's on the action side, but it's we shouldn't be looking at desire. I mean, we've got, as it were, we can think of both knowledge and belief as on the input side to practical reasoning. Action is on the output side. So we want something else that's kind of on the output side of practical reasoning. And so it seems to me that a better suggestion than desire is intention. Intention in the sense of intending to do something, because that's the natural outcome of a piece of practical. I mean, this is where the natural immediate outcome of a piece of practical reasoning, that So that's the analogy as I've put it here. So let me just explain a little bit about the way I'm using the terminology. So when I talk about intention, I'm talking about intending to do something, or at least that's the typical case, is intending to do something. I've got the analog of truth as success, and I have to be careful about what I mean by success here. So if we're talking about the intention, just to use the example I've got on the handout, the intention to drop the vase, then success means that you do drop the vase. Now, of course, if you have an intention to drop the vase, there's probably some further purpose that you're aiming to achieve by dropping the vase. For example, you're aiming to irritate the owner of the vase or something like that. And just dropping the vase does not guarantee success in that further sense. I mean, it might be that the owner of the vase is delighted to see the back of it. It was given to him by his mother-in-law or something, and he's always hated it. And so success just means this immediate realization of the intention. Realization just in the sense that you do in fact do what you intend to do. There's another aspect of this analogy which I should say something about, because you might notice that there's a grammatical asymmetry between the left-hand side and the right-hand side, in that in the left-hand side I'm using sentences as complements. So we're talking about believing that it's raining, knowing that it's raining. Whereas on the right-hand side, I've just got infinitives as the complements, intending to drop the vase, or intention. Well, it's not exactly an infinitive, but intentionally dropping the vase. And so you might wonder about that grammatical asymmetry and think that suggests that maybe something's going a bit wrong with the analogy. But actually, the only reason that I put it in this form is because, at least in English, these are the most sort of everyday constructions. And so I wanted to emphasize that what we're talking about here is not some kind of peculiar sorts of philosophers' cases, but very, very everyday matters, in the same way that knowledge is itself a very everyday notion. And in fact, there's a lot of reason to think that even with these phrases like, John intends to drop the vase or whatever, that actually there is a tacit, implicit grammatical subject, which is John. It's just that it's being omitted. And in fact, you can have cases where the grammatical subject of the verb intend is different from the grammatical subject of the complement verb. So an example would be that a controlling mother might intend her son to become a doctor, right? So the mother intends her son to become a doctor. Or we might say that we intend this room to be used by guests or something. So there we've got the subject, which is different from the subject of intend, being made explicit, because otherwise we wouldn't know what we were talking about here. And so, in effect, although the grammar is still slightly different, but fundamentally we're actually dealing with a sentence here. And even in the cases where there's no subject made explicit, that's what we don't, because we don't need to make it explicit. It's understood. And actually, there's a phenomenon here which may be worth remarking on, which might seem like a counterexample to this, but I think when you think it through, you realize it actually confirms this diagnosis, is that we can make the subject explicit where but it has a funny kind of effect. So, I mean, for example, suppose I say, I intend myself to have a drink. That sounds as though I'm somehow taking some kind of rather manipulative attitude to myself here in intending myself to have a drink. It's different from just saying I intend to have a drink. But I think the explanation for that is that the normal thing, if it's just a normal case where I intend to have a drink, would be to omit the inner subject, because it would be understood. And just say I intend to have a drink. So if I do make the inner subject explicit, the hearer is entitled to assume that there's something unusual about the case, and the natural hypothesis for the hearer to make is that the reason for making the subject explicit is that this is a case which is similar to cases where we have to make the subject explicit, as in these examples. And the natural dimension of similarity would be that I'm taking a kind of strange third-person attitude to myself. You know, in fact, you know, for example, I tend to forget to have a drink even when I need one, and so I might have to sort of manipulate myself into having a drink by leaving reminders to myself or something. So treating myself in a kind of third-person way. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression, but actually the take-home message here is simply that. From a logical point of view, fundamentally we're dealing with a sentential component with both the intending and intentionally doing on the one side, and the knowing and believing on the other side. And there are constructions in English where you can make that explicit. I mean, you can, either we could say, I intend to be such that P, where P is a sentence, or even I intend that P. I mean, they're not very usual, but they are well formed. Okay, so that gives you just the way I'm going to run this analogy. Of course, a very natural question to ask at this point is, well, where does all this leave desire? I mean, I scrubbed desire out from the official analogy and replaced it by intention, but we've still got to find some place for desire in this whole picture. Now, my tentative view about the best place for desire, which is considerably more speculative than the rest of this. I mean, you could say it's all a bit speculative, but this is even more speculative, is I'm actually quite sympathetic to the picture of desire as some kind of belief. So there would be some kind of desiring to fight along the lines of believing that it would be good to fight. Where the good here is, it's not specifically a moral notion. It's some much more generic notion of good. Of course, that's a highly controversial view, but let me just briefly discuss an example that will bring out some of these points about the contrast between desire and intention, and suggest that, at least in these respects, that desire is working more like belief. So take the case of Buridan's ass, a good example to use in Paris. This is the donkey that is faced with two symmetrically placed bales of hay, which look equally attractive. And the problem for the donkey is to break the symmetry and actually it's got to eat one of these bales of hay first. If it can't make up its mind because there's no basis for choosing between them, then it's going to starve to death. And it doesn't really make sense for the donkey to desire one of these bales of hay more than the other, which goes along with the fact that from the donkey's point of view, that the bales are equally good. But what does make sense is for the donkey to intend to eat one of them rather than the other. I mean, or at least to eat one of them first. So it's perfectly sensible for the donkey to intend to eat the bale on the right first and not intend to eat the bale on the left first. Although, in a way, it doesn't really make sense for it to desire to eat the bale on the right first and not desire to eat the bale on the left first. So the donkey's real problem is getting from a symmetry of desire to an asymmetry of intention. And that goes with the picture that, as it were, that desire is more on the kind of knowledge-belief side of the input to practical reasoning, and intention is on the output side. Of course, what we're not going to be able to get is any kind of purely rational, if you like, deterministic sort of argument to an intention, but precisely because of the complete symmetry between the two bales. But I'm going to be using the term practical reasoning in a quite broad sense, in which even a process that involves a random element, as it were, the donkey tossing a mental coin, can count as part of practical reasoning. Okay, so that's just a little fragment of support for the idea that we should think of desire in this way. Of course, a natural challenge to this is, but what about the difference in direction of fit between desire and belief? Doesn't that preclude subsuming desire under belief? But there you have to be very careful about direction of fit for what. because there's a fitting world-to-mind direction of fit for the to-fi bit. But the direction of fit that's relevant to believing doesn't have to-fi as its complement, because that's not the complement of believe. It has the whole proposition, it would be good to phi, as its complement. And so you can have one direction of fit for the proposition that it would be good to phi, and a different direction of fit for the proposition that one phi's. So actually the difference in direction of fit, once one's disambiguated which complement one's talking about, does not preclude the subsumption of desire under belief. Good. Well, I'll just say now some sort of fairly elementary points about the logical symmetry between the two sides of this analogy. Because I haven't yet said very much to justify the analogy. So the first point, which I think I mentioned already in giving an initial motivation, is that just as knowing entails truth, acting entails success. So, for example, if you know that it's raining, it follows that it is raining. And if you intentionally drop the vase, it follows that you drop the vase. But by contrast, believing does not entail truth, and intending does not entail success. So that you can believe that it's raining, even and if in fact it's not raining, you can be mistaken in your beliefs. And similarly, you can intend to do something, but not do it, obviously. And from those two, it also follows that believing doesn't entail knowledge, because if believing entailed knowledge, it would also entail truth. And it follows that intending does not entail acting, because if it did entail acting, it would entail success. Slightly less obvious, but I think we can accept for present purposes that knowing entails believing. If you know that it's raining, it follows that you believe that it's raining. People have questioned this, but I think we can hold on to this principle. And similarly, acting entails intending. And remember how I explained acting as intentionally doing something. So if you intentionally drop the vase, it follows that at the relevant time you intended to drop the vase. And so from what we've already said, it follows that knowing entails believing truly, and that acting entails intending successfully. But slightly less trivially, the converses don't follow. So believing truly does not entail knowing, and intending successfully does not entail acting. You can, in the second case, what that means is that you can intend to phi, and indeed phi, even though you didn't intentionally phi. So in the case of believing truly without knowing, I mean, just any case of, well, for example, a standard type of case would be some very gullible person who believes whatever their guru tells them. And their guru likes to make an idiot of them and just feeds them a whole lot of random stuff, most of which is false, but occasionally slips in some truths as well. And if this gullible idiot happens to believe some correct dates in history simply because they're trusting their guru, then they don't count as knowing that that was the date of the Battle of Austerlitz or whatever. And in the case of intending successfully without acting, so here's an example. suppose that you intend, you're an assassin. You intend to kill your boss's rival, and you've been sent off to kill him, and you're driving to the spot where you're going to set up your rifle and shoot him. And as you're driving along, thinking out how you're going to do the shooting, you knock over a pedestrian who is in fact your boss's rival. So you intended to kill your boss's rival, and you did kill your boss's rival, but you didn't intentionally kill your boss's rival. I mean, it was not because in some way the intention and the success were not connected in the right way. Now, in the case of knowledge, the fact that we've got these two necessary conditions for knowledge, which are not jointly sufficient, the belief and the truth, has led people from Plato onwards to wonder what further conditions we need to add to belief and truth to get knowledge. So, as it were, people have tried to solve the equation knowledge equals belief plus truth plus X. So roughly speaking, they're thinking, what is knowledge minus belief minus truth? Of course, a very important point is that this use of arithmetical notation is entirely metaphorical, and it's not clear that there is a good enough logical analog of subtraction. There's of course, in the 1950s, the standard view was that what you needed to add to belief and truth to get knowledge was justification, and then Gettier showed that that's something wrong with that, and then there's been this enormous post-Gettier industry of trying to find further, more complicated things to add to belief and truth to get knowledge. There's been a somewhat similar, although not quite as large-scale, industry in the philosophy of action, of trying to analyze action as intention plus success plus something else, which, like the program for analyzing knowledge in terms of belief and truth and other factors, has also, in my view, and I think in an increasingly generally accepted view, been a degenerating research program. Of course, I'm not going to try to illustrate the ways in which all these different attempts have failed, except to take one very sort of salient case, which is salient because it fits so naturally with the structure that we've been talking about up to now. So, given that the direction of fit that we want on the knowledge side and the knowledge belief side is fitting mind to world, it's natural to attempt some kind of causal analysis of knowledge. So, as it were, the picture would be what we need to add to belief and truth is a causal connection between the belief and the truth. And since it's fitting mind to world and the truth is the world side, we want the direction of causation to go from truth to belief. And so that gives us, as it were, a simple causal analysis of knowledge. Knowing is believing caused by truth. And then on the other side of the analogy, causal analyses of actions have also been attempted, but with the causation going in the opposite direction because the fitting is supposed to go in the opposite direction. So success is the worldly thing on the action side, and since what we're concerned with is fitting world to mind, the success should be as well the effect rather than the cause, and so that suggests a simple analysis of acting as success caused by intending. And but notoriously, neither of those analyses works, and they actually fail for very closely related reasons, which is known as the phenomenon of deviant causal change. So I'll just illustrate the two cases. In the case of the causal analysis of knowing, we could have somebody who, let's say, who has a brain tumor, and one effect of the brain tumor is that as their brain gets distorted, they form all sorts of beliefs for which they have no evidence, and one of those beliefs is the belief that they have a brain tumor. So it's a belief caused, maybe it's a brain tumor of exactly the relevant type. So there we've got the believing caused by truth, but they don't know that they've got a brain tumor. They have no evidence that they have a brain tumor. And there are similar kinds of counterexamples to the causal analysis of action. So an example of that would be, suppose that you intend to drop someone's precious vase. So you're standing there holding the vase, and you're getting all excited about this dramatic thing that you're about to do. And as you get excited, your hands start sweating. And as a result of the sweating in your hands, the vase slips through your hands, and so you've dropped it, and the dropping of the vase was caused by the intention, but you didn't intentionally drop the vase. You weren't even ready to drop the vase. So you can see there's a kind of analogy between what goes wrong with the causal analysis of knowledge in terms of belief and truth, and what goes wrong with the causal analysis of action in terms of intention and success. So, I won't pursue the analogy further, but in both cases, the moral that I think we should draw from these arguably degenerating research programs is that we're pursuing a wrong-headed level of direction of explanation. So I want to paint very briefly an alternative picture on both the knowledge and the action side, where we take knowledge and action as primitives in terms of which we understand other phenomena. And so the central idea is just that the paradigm of intelligent life is acting on what you know, acting on your knowledge. One might feel that in some sense, evolutionary, functional, that as well, that's the point of having a mind, so that you can get knowledge of the world and act on it, so that your behavior can be more flexible and more sensitively adjusted to the complexities and changes of the world that you live in a way that isn't possible for a mindless being. So the case where everything goes well is just the case where you act on what you know, and then practical reasoning is the kind of reasoning that mediates between the knowledge and the action. But then there are going to be a whole lot of cases which resemble this good case in some local way, as it were, internally to this nexus of practical reasoning, but which differ from it when you look at the wider picture, in particular when you look at the external world. So that there'll be cases where what it feeds into the practical reasoning is not knowledge but belief, because something has gone wrong in the acquisition of your beliefs. But nevertheless, they're still treated as if they were knowledge in the process of practical reasoning, and then you get some kind of output. And similarly, on the output side, there'll be cases where you form an intention in the normal way, just as in the good case, but where the intention is never realized. You never actually do the thing that you intend to do. And then the picture would be something like this, that belief is a more general category than knowledge, which, roughly speaking, we apply to those cases which play the same local role in practical reasoning as knowledge does, even though, as it were, globally, they may be different in all sorts of ways. And intention is what plays the same local role in practical reasoning as action does, even though, obviously, of course, the global role may be missing because the intention is never actually carried out. Now, I've been talking about the good case as the case where you act on what you know. But, I mean, you might wonder why I've insisted that that's what the good case is, rather than something less demanding, why we shouldn't just categorize as the good case any case in which you have true belief, rather than specifically knowledge, and in which the outcome is successful. Well, it's success, it's intention plus success, whether or not we actually get action, i.e. intentionally doing the thing. So why have I insisted that it really has to be knowledge on the input side and action on the output side? Well, I think this is a kind of contrast that we have with all sorts of functional notions, where we have things which have a certain function, and where you could, as it were, get the immediate rewards of that function, even though those things may be malfunctioning. So, I mean, if you take the heart, the function of the heart is to pump the blood. But presumably, as long as the blood circulates, as it were, you'll get what you need, even if the heart isn't pumping the blood, but it's doing something weird. I mean, imagine some kind of science fictional case where there's something bizarrely wrong with your heart, so that instead of pumping the blood, it's by some kind of sucking mechanism, it manages to get the blood to circulate. As long as it circulates in the right way, presumably you stay alive. But if the heart is doing some weird thing like that and not actually pumping the blood, the heart is malfunctioning, even though the blood may be circulating. And similarly, I think in cases where you have true belief without knowledge, or successful intention without action. Those are cases like the blood somehow circulating even though the heart isn't pumping it, where there's a malfunction even though by some kind of bizarre chance the function isn't producing any immediately harmful effects. So that's the kind of overall picture, and it's a picture where, in very rough terms, we're understanding belief in terms of knowledge and intention in terms of action, rather than the other way round. Although what I've been offering is nothing like a precise analysis. I think one shouldn't expect anything as demanding as that. And I hope that the picture that I've given helps to make various kind of knowledge norms that I and other people have discussed look fairly natural. So, for example, Hawthorne and Stanley have discussed a knowledge norm for action, which I mean is something I've also expressed sympathy for, which is a norm that says that the premises of practical reasoning should be known by the reasoner. They should express the reasoner's knowledge. So there's something wrong with practical reasoning if the reasoner doesn't know the premises. And so that's very much part of this picture. I think you might feel the knowledge norm for assertion would also look quite natural within this general picture. I won't say much more than that, but I think in this sort of functional way, it's clear that knowledge is going to play some kind of normative role, because it's what you have when practical reasoning goes well. So finally, I'll just say a few words about what we can do with this kind of analogy. Because, of course, all analogies have their, I mean, if they're really just analogies, they're not identities, they have their limitations, but they can still be extremely fertile. Just to give you an analogy with another analogy, in metaphysics, there are kind of analogies between space, time, and possibility, where there's a sort of spectrum with, roughly speaking, with space at close to one end and possibility close to the other, and a lot of disagreement about whether time is more like space or like possibility. These analogies, from a formal point of view, are very clear. I mean, for example, you know, if you take the words here, now, and actual, they behave in very, very similar ways. And you know, for any kind of argument about one of these things, you can produce formally analogous arguments about the others. And this is a kind of methodology that people in metaphysics are very used to doing. So, and it's not that they're insisting that if one of these the arguments is sound, then the others have to be sound as well, because everybody concedes that we have to take seriously the idea that at some point we'll come across a disanalogy between these terms. But it's still extremely fruitful just to think about what the analogous arguments are for the other two terms. And often they have the effect of enabling us to see the original argument in a new light to see problems with it that were not immediately obvious, and as it were, it's at least some kind of test about the way we were thinking about one of these, to look at how the analogous arguments on the other side go. And, and I suggest that we can apply a similar test in the case of knowledge and action, but by, as we're looking at arguments on one side of this analogy and seeing what the corresponding argument would be on the other, we can at least cast a different light on the considerations that we were originally thinking about. And I've already been suggesting that in the case of the marginalization of knowledge in a lot of epistemology of the kind that I don't like, that once we realize that the analog of marginalizing knowledge is marginalizing action, then that ought to give us second thoughts about marginalizing knowledge. Of course, some people would just go ahead and marginalize action too, but I think it's perhaps easier to see that that's a kind of fundamentally wrong-headed thing to do. And another application of this methodology would be to the case of skepticism. I mean, suppose that we think of the skeptic as someone who denies that anybody knows anything. Then the analog of skepticism on the action side is going to be the denial that anyone ever intentionally does anything. And if that sounds crazy, as I pretty much think it is, then that should make us more unwilling to take the skeptic seriously, although, of course, we've got lots of other reasons for not taking the skeptic too seriously anyway. Okay, so there are lots of further issues about how this picture is to be developed. I mean, for example, in the paper I say a little bit about how to fit in the phenomena of trying, of perceiving, and of having reasons into this picture. But well, if you want to, we can talk about it in discussion. But I think that's a good place to stop.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Tim, for this brilliant and very rich talk. I think there's going to be a lot of questions. I just would like to start the discussion by asking you something I feel, of course, extremely close to your prospect of dealing with knowledge and action as both two primitives. Right? And also I think that if you manage to have a real theory of what it is to acting on what you know, then sure, this is the best situation what one could dream of, right? The problem is that it is a situation which all philosophers have tried at least at some point to come to, and they always fell on some problems, right? When you think, for example, the way the Cartesians said, well, when there is an adequacy between your will and your understanding, well, then it's all perfect. Then your action is, you act on knowledge, and this is perfectly fine, except that there are so many situations in which you cannot find this adequacy. And I think the prospect is extremely fascinating, especially considering what you said about knowledge already. And I realize very well that you intend to do for acting what you did for knowledge. And that's something also I think we should all be trying to do. I still have some worries on some specific issues that have to do, for example, you alluded to, in the last part of your talk, of the space of reasons. Is it that easy within your framework to overcome all the really difficult situations you have between the dilemma between epistemic and practical reasons, for example? Do you think there might be a fine way to solve such difficult issues in the type of the ethics of belief? Or do you think that it's just all misplaced, the way people have dealt with these issues?
Well, so the general notion of a reason, I think of as a simply some fact or truth, and then the reasons that someone has, as well, what it is to possess a reason is simply to know the fact or truth. Of course, I mean, this is extremely contested because it's very, very tempting to think that there are non-factive reasons. That's to say that that when somebody acts on a false belief, that somehow that's a reason too. I think all of that is fundamentally an illusion, but I don't think it's kind of a very obvious illusion. I mean, I think one way in which it's one can argue it is that when we're talking about somebody acting on reasons, we can say she fied because P. I mean, she fied because the child was hungry or whatever it is, and the because is factive. I mean, if she fied because P, it follows that P, and so we just on those general logical grounds we can't put anything false in there. I mean, there's an awful lot more to be said, but I think if you look at the literature on reasons, you see that people talk in terms of subjective and objective reasons. I mean, there are these two kinds of reasons, subjective and objective, which, to my mind, is like saying that there are two kinds of gold. There's real gold and fool's gold. There's something messed up about that analogy, messed up about that way of thinking of reasons. And what we're really talking about is things that people mistakenly take to be reasons. But this it's sort of hard to make this very clear, because something that's that we get actually all over the place, but is particularly common with reasons talk, is that we have a tendency to talk in a kind of projective manner in which we tell a story from the point of view of the subject. And so we say things which, because the subject would at that point have assented to them. But once you realize that this is in fact a completely universal tendency, even if it's stronger in some areas than in others, you see that we should not be multiplying senses of reason or senses of know or anything else to take account of it. So, for example, you can say that the doorbell rang, there was a policeman standing at the door, and then later on you can spring a surprise and say, of course, the policeman wasn't really a policeman; it was a con man, and so on. But so when you said the police, but that's not because we have a second sense of policeman, where the word policeman means someone who looks like a policeman. It's just because we're telling the story from the subject's point of view. Sorry, a lot of the reasons talk is very hard to tease out, but I think fundamentally we're dealing with something that is just as factive and knowledge-based as these other things. Now, you specifically asked about the distinction between epistemic and pragmatic reasons for belief. And, I take it that the central distinction that we want to make there is between reasons for believing P, which are evidence for P, roughly speaking, which raise the probability of the evidential probability of P, versus reasons for believing P, which are not evidence for P, but just evidence that our life would be better if we believe P, or something like that. And so, that's a distinction which can be made in this framework, although of course it can be made in other frameworks as well.
Okay, just a very quick question, and then ask. It's about the desire part, because it seems to me that the framework can work only if you accept the premise that you said that desire could be subsumed under belief. Now, this is something which precisely, it seems to me, not so easy to come up to. And as Aristotle said, part of the problems he had with the type of action, or acting on knowledge in the domain of ethics, was that desire, he couldn't account for it in terms of any form of knowledge, right, of nous. And so he had to deal with this and introduce another type of knowledge, phronesis, in order precisely to cope with all the discrepancies he had. So, don't you think that, you had an argument for saying that the difference, the asymmetry between the direction of it, between belief and desire, was something you could overcome, but I was not. Could you just say a little more about this?
Well, one possibility about what was blocking Aristotle's attempt to go this way is that fundamentally he was thinking of, as were knowledge on the cognitive side, on a very theoretical model, which had to do with explanations using general premises and so on. And it seems to me that a lot of knowledge is much more particular and much harder to fit into any kind of theoretical framework.
May I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Precisely what my point was that precisely in the ethical domain, he didn't use that kind of model of knowledge. He said there might be another kind of model in the ethical domain, which had to do precisely with dealing with particular circumstances, which was the phronesis, and which had to cope precisely with this, precisely because in the domain of practical lives and activities, then you had to introduce another type of conception of knowledge. And so my point was precisely on this very, very issue, that when it comes to action and to intentional action, then it seems very difficult not to try and introduce some distinctions in the type of knowledge you want to deal with in order to account for some specific aspects of intentional action, and in particular with the desire aspect of intentional action.
But I mean, a lot of perceptual knowledge has this particular untheoretical quality as well. So, you know, I don't think that this is a sort of a distinction between, as it were, knowledge on the practical side and knowledge on the theoretical side. I think it's, I mean, what I would suggest is that, as it were, the normal sort of human knowledge has this highly particular, untheorized quality, and then in special cases, we've been able to produce science or some kind of systematic body of principles which gives us, the knowledge a rather unusual, much more theorized character. But that's, I mean, this might very roughly correspond to the difference in psychology between System 1 and System 2 thinking. I mean, won't exactly, but because of course both System 1 and System 2 can be matters of belief rather than knowledge. But so it seems to me that we're not, you know, it's not that there's this sort of separate domain, you know, of normal human activity, which is radically different from the practical side. It's just that so starting from the normal human cognition, which has this kind of messy, somewhat particular quality, we can occasionally construct these rather artificial, though admirable, systematic islands of systematicity within the general, as it were, messy, I mean, ocean of particularity.